I'll live with my eldest son and his wife, so get out. I was stunned by Dan's words. As if to add insult to injury, Megan also started berating me. Exactly, you're in the way, so leave. You parasite and waste of space. I was speechless. These people really need to understand their place. They better brace themselves. Those were just the words that came to my mind in the heat of the moment. Oh, I see. My feelings were just one-sided after all. Dan doesn't care about me at all. That's why he can say such things to me without hesitation. Why did I endure all this? I should have just divorced him without thinking. If I had, I wouldn't feel so miserable now. Oh, it's no use anymore. I have no choice but to make him understand my position by any means necessary. As soon as I resolved myself, a forced smile spilled from my lips. My name is Grace Johnson. I'm a 52-year-old full-time employee at a food manufacturing company. Being a full-time employee at this age often leads people to assume I'm single. But I'm not. I married Dan in my 20s, and soon after, our son Alex was born. Alex is now independent and even married. So now, it's just Dan, his mother Helen, and me living happily together. But it's not without problems. Yoko is elderly and her legs aren't what they used to be. I often need to lend a hand. However, Dan pretends not to see his own mother's struggles. She's your mother, aren't you going to help her? Dan turned away at my question. I wish he would think more about his family. Lately, I've been feeling this way more and more. Dan works as a graphic designer. He's independent now, but he used to work in the creative department of an advertising agency. That's where I met Dan when he was at the advertising agency. Is there anything you're concerned about? Dan, who had come to my company for work, asked me this question. This part is a bit. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't have said anything as an amateur. No, advertising isn't only for professionals to look at. Your input is very helpful. Dan was kind in his response. Such a kind person. That was my impression of Dan at the time. After that, as we kept in touch through work, Dan asked me out. Of course, I accepted, and eventually, we got married. However, about 10 years into our marriage, Dan said something unexpected. I'm thinking of quitting my job and going independent. Can you make it on your own? I continued working even after our marriage. So, we had some financial flexibility. But Alex, who was born soon after our marriage, was in upper elementary school at the time. Things are fine now, but they will cost more in the future with tutoring and other expenses. Plus, Dan and I might not be able to work at some point. Thinking about that, I just couldn't understand Dan's decision to leave his stable job. That's why I responded that way. I'll still get work from my old company, so it's fine. Besides, you do side jobs too, right? What? Side jobs? You used to go to the office, but now you work from home, right? That's what I'm talking about. In fact, after getting married, I switched to working from home. Of course, this was to increase the time I spend at home. And ensure I didn't neglect the household chores. The vacancy for managing the company's e-commerce site was also conveniently available. That's how I managed to get into remote work. Yet, Dan seemed to think I had quit my job to do piecework. That's not piecework, I just shifted my job to home-based. Don't put on airs. Even piecework is a respectable job. I explained several times, but Dan wouldn't listen. Eventually, our discussion ended with Dan still misunderstanding. After that, we had several discussions, but Dan refused to change his mind. As time went on, Dan quit his job and went independent. I was terribly anxious. But, contrary to my worries, his work seemed to be going well. He looked healthier than before, and most importantly, he seemed more relaxed. It looks like things are going well.
Yeah.
My former colleagues give me work. And I get to spend time with Alex on my days off. It's great. That sounds wonderful. I was relieved. But a few years later, a different problem arose. I brought up this issue to Dan. What? You want to put mom in a nursing home? Your mother herself said she wants to go. She said her legs are getting weak and she wants to move in. What do you mean? Dan's tone became accusatory, and I found it hard to speak. I want to take care of my mother-in-law too. But with both household and work responsibilities, it's not easy. Additionally, Alex was entering middle school and preparing for high school entrance exams. It's a time when various aspects of our lives need attention. So I can't focus solely on my mother-in-law. I explained all this to Dan. Then, Dan became upset and started complaining. Are you planning to abandon my mom? It's not like that, but your mother. But that's what it comes down to. If it's that hard, why don't you just quit your piecework? I was dumbfounded by Dan's words. Our household finances are currently sustained by my salary. Dan contributes too, but it's just a little. So, if I quit my job, we wouldn't be able to live. However, I couldn't tell Dan this truth. Dan has too much pride. If he knew I was earning more, he'd surely sulk like a child. Divorce is one thing, but he might even run away from home on his own. If that happened, I wouldn't be able to support Alex and my mother-in-law by myself. That's why I couldn't say anything. In the end, my inability to speak up brought the discussion to a close. That aside, not placing my mother-in-law in a nursing home wouldn't increase my burden. Indeed, her legs are getting weaker. Yet, she can still manage most things on her own. And there aren't many situations where I need to help her. As long as she's sitting, she can even cook. So, for me, it was more helpful to have my mother-in-law at home helping with household chores. As time passed, Alex became a high school student, and eventually, he went on to college. Then, Alex moved out. My burden suddenly lessened, and gradually, I found more time to attend to my mother-in-law. On one particular holiday, I agreed to accompany my mother-in-law shopping at her request. That's when I asked Dan to drive. Hey, could you drive? I'm going shopping with your mother. Sorry, I have work today. At a glance, Dan was wearing a suit. But something felt off. Hey, what's with that suit?
Ah.
I bought it. It was a bit expensive, but as the president, I thought I should wear nice things. Dan answered that. I can see what he's saying. But Dan started his company a long time ago. It feels a bit late now. A sudden change in attire is evidence of cheating. I remembered reading an article online about that. But there's no evidence. Reluctantly, I sent Dan off. Later, I took a taxi with my mother-in-law, but all day I couldn't stop thinking about Dan. Is he really cheating? After that, I started to suspect Dan. I decided to confront Dan if the opportunity arose. With that thought, I continued with my daily life. However, Dan didn't slip up. Only time kept passing. Eventually, Alex informed us that he had found a job, and later, he even announced his marriage. Still, I couldn't find any evidence of Dan's infidelity. I haven't found any proof of cheating, but Alex is married now. So maybe it's okay to just divorce normally. I began to think that way. During that time, one night, my mother-in-law went to the bathroom and injured her leg. Fortunately, the injury wasn't serious. However, she was shocked and said something unexpected. I guess I should enter a nursing home. And, I have a favor to ask. The situation was completely different from before. If I divorced, my mother-in-law might be neglected. Thinking that, I couldn't refuse her request. This time, I decided to do as my mother-in-law wished. That was about 6 months ago. Since then, I've been visiting her every holiday. I'm still worried about my mother-in-law. So I can't seem to go through with the divorce. I muttered that to myself on my way home. I'm home.
Ah.
Mom. Welcome back. It was Alex who spoke. Next to him was his wife, Megan. We've been waiting for you, Mother. Why are Alex and Megan here? Wondering, I asked Alex. Alex? Why are you at home? Well, about that. It was just when Alex was about to answer. Dan peeked his face from behind Alex and said to me, "You are so heartless, I decided to divorce you. That's why I called them here." What do you mean? It's about Mom. You've abandoned your duties as a daughter-in-law. Dan raised his voice. I flinched. But your mother. Before I could finish, Dan cut me off. No excuses. I'll live with my eldest son and his wife, so get out. I was stunned by Dan's words. As if to add insult to injury, Megan also started berating me. Exactly, you're in the way, so leave. You parasite and waste of space. I was speechless. These people really need to understand their place. They better brace themselves. Those words just popped into my head in the moment. Oh, so, were my feelings one-sided? Dan doesn't care about me at all. That's why he can say such things to me without hesitation. Why did I put up with it? I should have just divorced him without a second thought. If I had, I wouldn't feel so miserable. Oh, it's hopeless. I have no choice but to make him understand my position by any means necessary. The moment I resolved myself, a forced laugh escaped me. Understood. I'll leave. After saying that, I walked past the three of them. I headed to my room. All I needed was some clothes and my work laptop. Then, I grabbed a few valuables as usual. I packed them into my travel bag. Are you really going to divorce? Yes, of course. I quickly grabbed my bags. Then, after a moment of thought, I said to Dan, "Well, I'll give you a peaceful divorce for $10,000. If you don't like that, I'll get a lawyer and drag it out." The compensation for infidelity seemed a bit low. But I don't have the energy to argue with Dan right now. That's why I deliberately offered him favorable terms. Why should I pay compensation? Because you're the one who brought up divorce. Even so. Dan started to say something, but I stared him down. Then, smiling, I told him, "Shall we get a lawyer involved? If you've been cheating, $10,000 won't cover it." What? At least $30,000. If you're not guilty, that would be better for you, right? I knew Dan would choose the former. In a way, it was a gamble. Dan gritted his teeth in frustration. Seeing his reaction, I was certain.
Ah.
He really was cheating. But I couldn't catch any proof. So, to corner Dan a bit more, I had no choice but to pretend I had evidence. What will you do? If we get a lawyer, I'll also claim compensation from your affair partner. I don't want to worry your mother. That's why I don't want to make a fuss. Dan hung his head at my words. Then, reluctantly, he answered. All right, I'll pay $10,000. This week. Then, that's settled. I'll come by on the weekend to sign the divorce papers. I smiled and walked past Dan. I left the house. I went to a nearby cafe and started looking for an apartment I could rent immediately. I looked around, but only short-stay apartments were available. For now, this will do. Reluctantly, I signed a contract for the short-stay apartment. and decided to live there for the time being. On the weekend, I headed to Dan's house. As I pressed the doorbell, Megan appeared. What? What are you doing here? I've come to collect my things. And there are some things like the divorce papers to handle. Is that so? With a snort, Megan dismissed me. I couldn't help but wonder why Alex had married someone like her. However, as I entered, Dan was waiting. There was an envelope on the table. That's the divorce papers. The compensation is inside too. Understood. Inside the envelope were the signed divorce papers and a bundle of $10,000. I checked it and put it in my bag. Then, I'll have the movers take my things from the room. Do whatever you want. Dan seemed sulky. Despite him being the one who wanted the divorce, I wondered what he was dissatisfied about. I shrugged and continued with the move. Eventually, when the moving was done, I handed Dan a bank book. This is the account book for the living expenses.
Ah.
You used to give it to me, but from now on, you'll have to transfer it yourself. I know. Dan snatched the bank book as if grabbing it. It was like dealing with a child. I couldn't help but be exasperated. Then, I went to where Alex and Megan were in the living room. I have something to discuss with you two. What is it? I don't really want to talk though. Take this. As soon as I produced the bank book, Megan's eyes lit up. Are you giving us money? No. It's the bank book for the living expenses. Oh. Megan visibly disappointed. Use it to manage the living expenses Alex gives you. Ugh. Such minor details, annoying person. Megan muttered. I pretended not to hear and told Megan. You will be managing the family's living expenses, including Dan's, all right?
Yeah.
Megan answered reluctantly. I sighed and left the room. Now that I had passed on the bank book for living expenses and secured the divorce papers, I had no further connection with Dan and his family. I felt somewhat relieved. Just a few days after this exchange, I was busy working in my room when my phone unexpectedly rang. Who could it be, at this busy time? Sighing, I picked up the phone. The screen showed Alex's name. Isn't he supposed to be at work? I glanced at the clock. It was just past 10 a.m. It was too early for lunch break, perhaps it was something urgent? With various thoughts swirling, I answered the call. Hello? What's the matter, Alex? Mom. Where are you? I'm at home, but what's up? As I asked back, Alex raised his voice even louder. The account is empty, what's going on? Startled by the loudness of his voice, I momentarily pulled the phone away from my ear. I quickly put it back and asked. Is that about the living expenses account I gave you? Of course. Why is it empty? How are we supposed to live like this? Well, that was the point. I had emptied the account before handing it over. The funds in it were from my salary for living expenses. So, I had no obligation to leave anything in there. Thinking this, I asked Alex. Haven't you deposited any living expenses? Alex mumbled in response. That's strange, what's going on? I asked again. Didn't you put in the living expenses? No. I thought you were putting it in. Why would I do that? I'm not living with you guys. Alex fell silent when I said this. I continued, trying to reason with him. I clearly told Megan to use the living expenses you provided. That's true, but it's not just about handing over your salary. What's so difficult about that? In a small voice, Alex muttered something. What? What did you say? I got fired, so I have no salary. Alex shouted. What? Fired? Yes. Actually, Alex began to explain why he had returned home. It was just before he moved back. Alex had made a major mistake at work. Of course, a mistake alone wouldn't lead to dismissal. But Alex tried to blame his subordinate for the mistake. Being caught would mean no promotion. Being demoted would be embarrassing. Out of self-preservation, he tried to pin it on someone else. However, it was quickly discovered. He was then pressured to resign. Then, don't you have any severance pay? There should be unemployment benefits too. It's all gone. I used it all up. Right after leaving his job, he had been living off his savings. Unemployment benefits made life easier than expected. He should have looked for another job during that time, but Alex did nothing. He believed he was competent enough to manage. He thought he could find a job anytime. Falling into such thinking, he ended up wasting time with Megan. When he finally started looking for a new job, no one would hire him. That's when the conversation about moving in with his father came up. I came here planning to live off Dad's money, but Dad keeps saying he has none. That's unfortunate. Mom, just deposit enough for 1 month, that's all I'm asking. Alex pleaded with me. That's when I said, even if you make it sound like a scam. This is no time for jokes. A joke? No, it's payback. Weren't you the ones who kicked me out? Alex fell silent for a moment when I said that, but he quickly retorted. Megan and Dad were the ones who kicked me out. I had nothing to do with it. By not stopping them, you were just as guilty. The three of you should reflect on this together. Goodbye. I hung up the phone. Then, I blocked his number. Hopefully, that will teach him a lesson. I waited for a call from the other two, laughing to myself. However, no matter how long I waited, Megan did not contact me. It's been almost a month since I divorced Dan. I expect Dan will contact me soon. I looked at the calendar. Today is the end of the month. If all goes well, Dan should contact me today. As I was thinking this, I received an email on my smartphone. Here it is. The email was a summons from Dan. Luckily, today was Sunday and I was off work. I excitedly headed to the meeting place. I had a good idea of what Dan wanted to talk about. The issue was how Dan would react when he learned the truth. When I entered the cafe where we were meeting, Dan was already there. Sorry to keep you waiting. I smiled and sat down opposite Dan. Glancing over, I noticed Megan was sitting next to him. When I stared intently at Megan, she began to complain, clearly uncomfortable. Don't stare at people like that. Oh, I'm sorry. And why are you here? This concerns our family's finances. Megan scowled. She seemed quite angry. Without that, there's no fun in getting revenge. I muttered to myself. Eventually, I looked at Dan, who hesitantly began to speak. Listen, I got a call from a real estate agent. Any idea what that might be about? A real estate agent? What about it? As I feigned ignorance, Megan got annoyed. Pointing at me, Megan said, you know something, don't you? Just confess already. Even if you say that. I pretended to be troubled. Then, Dan leaned forward slightly. The real estate agent was saying something about rent. But we own our home. That's right. So I told them they were mistaken, but then they threatened to sue me. Dan tapped the table with his fingertips, clearly irritated. Seeing his frustration, I decided to reveal the truth. Did you make sure to transfer the living expenses? Huh? Oh, yes, I transferred it. That's a lie. If you had, we wouldn't be in this situation. Dan flinched at my words. I smiled as I told him the truth. The rent is for your mother's house. It's supposed to be deducted from the bank account I gave you. Wait. Our house is paid off. We don't have any rent to pay. That's because your mother sold the house. It's not yours to own anymore. Dan and Megan looked puzzled by my explanation. I then started explaining everything from the beginning. A while back, when my mother-in-law decided to move into a care facility, there was one problem. We could manage the monthly fees with her pension, but the initial costs were unaffordable. That's when I suggested a leaseback to her. With a leaseback, there's no need to move, and she could get a lump sum of money. However, she would need to pay rent to continue living there. So, I decided to use the $500 you had been putting into the house as rent. What about the living expenses? I've been covering all of that myself. About $2,000 a month. Dan and Megan were shocked. If you had continued to pay the living expenses, it would have just been deducted as rent. But if you understood, then transfer it immediately. And keep doing so, okay? As I laughed, Dan began to panic. Realizing something was off, eventually, Dan confessed. Actually, the company went under. What? Why? It's just that. Dan was at a loss for words. Then, Megan, looking irritated next to him, pointed at Dan. It's because this man was having an affair and squandering money on some woman. That's why we went bankrupt. Here's what Megan said. Dan had been using company funds to support his mistress, which led to the company's bankruptcy. But he couldn't tell me about the bankruptcy. So, he relied on Alex's income and called Alex and his wife back home. It's all your fault, isn't it? No, that's not it. I didn't. How is it Grace's fault? Blaming others. You and your son both. Megan's anger erupted. Eventually, the two of them started arguing, so I quietly left the cafe. Later, Dan and Alex looked for new jobs. But they weren't easy to find. As the deadline for the rent payment approached, they reluctantly started working part-time at a store. However, Alex couldn't stand being directed by younger students and quickly quit. Dan, mocked for his age, also stopped going to work. Eventually, the two borrowed money from dubious lenders and ended up being sent to work on a fishing boat to pay off their debts. Now, they are fishing for crabs up north. Meanwhile, Megan quickly gave up on the two. She left home and initially returned to her parents' house. However, debt collectors showed up there too, and now she's working hard in a nightclub. As for me, I'm enjoying living alone. I occasionally visit my mother-in-law, leading a fulfilling life. She asks me if I plan to remarry, but I'm not in the mood just yet. However, there's one staff member at the care facility who has caught my interest. It seems my mother-in-law has noticed, but I hope she'll just watch over me for a while longer.